Good evening, everyone. Sorry. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, sorry about that noisy start. What I'm going to do first is, before I introduce Professor Mark Solms, I'm going to send around a register for people who are not on our mailing list. Okay, a lot of you I recognize from summer school and from other lectures. Those who are not on a mailing list, and you're interested in receiving our notices of lectures like this, and summer school, which starts in about 6-7 weeks' time, put your name on and we'll send you a summer school mailing brochure, and every time we have a lecture, we'll send out a notice for you. Okay? And just send it around and back to the front, and I'll collect it in the front. And now it is my absolute privilege to introduce Professor Mark Solms, whom I've been trying for years to get hold of. For years. So I was very pleased that he finally agreed to a lecture. He is, you will see, a riveting lecturer, and legendary in some areas, which I won't say. But he's also, so let me just read, doesn't do justice to him, a very, very short description of himself. Okay? So he's the director of neuropsychology at this university. He's best known for his research on the brain mechanisms and dreaming. He's published over 300 scientific and scholarly papers and 8 books. I have no idea where you find the time, and I know he travels extensively. He's an A-rated researcher, an honorary fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, co-chair of the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society, research chair of International Psychoanalytical Association, and science director of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Please welcome Professor Solms.
Sorry, we just got to bear with this noise for a second. How's that? Okay, very good. I'm very glad to be here. I didn't know it was so hard to get hold of me. As far as I'm aware, as soon as you asked me, I said enthusiastic yes. Yeah. So this topic, oh, it's gone.
Have you not just done that?
No, because that's there.
Okay, let's just have a look here. There we go. Who helped you set this up? Just press. Who's the person who helped you to set it up?
Well, I actually worked it out myself.
It was your. What about just?
No, I
it is power. You also the power. Yeah, that should be good. Two projectors. Yeah, this one's not one. One should be enough though. The middle one actually is the one we're after. Okay, left and centre. There we go. Projector left and centre. It should be fine. Just take it away from that and take it back. Yeah. What happened? Oh yeah. So now, let me just try and think. So the power is on. Don't press the power button. Whatever you do. And let's just try that power.
That one doesn't do anything.
But in any event, this is projector left and centre. We've got the centre projector. Here we go. Here we've got a clever person. Are you able to revive this wiki mail here?
The power is on.
Yeah, and that power is on. That power. Yeah, it's just no.
I think it's blown a bulb.
Okay, but then can we not move to one of the other projectors to the side? To do the left or the right one? Just work, because we can work with one.
It's just that they take time to.
Yeah, I shouldn't have asked you. Look, the only thing we can do one of there's 3 projectors. So one of them should have a bulb. If not, the only thing we can do is I can go one lecture theatre along, set up, and we trail everybody out.
Okay, well, let's see.
Here we go.
There you go. There it's coming. That flashing means it's warming up.
Here we go. Thank you.
So we have a smaller version of the lecture, but at least it's up. Can you all see that? Yeah. Oh, we got two. Okay. So, apologies for that on behalf of this great university. So what I was about to say is that this topic, I mean, I've worked on various things over the years in my field, which are fascinating. It's a fantastic field. I recommend it to all of you. I don't know why anyone does anything other than this. But of all the things that I've worked on, really, this excites me the most. So I'm very keen to talk to you about it. I'm busy writing a book about it. And so the problem is that I've got too much in my mind, too much detail. So I hope I'm going to be able to distill it in a sufficiently comprehensible fashion. So here's a little outline of my talk. I'm going to start out talking about something called the functionalist problem of consciousness that might, well, it will sound incomprehensible, but I'll explain. And then I'm going to make the perhaps unexpected claim that consciousness is not a cognitive function, that it is, my third point, instead an affective function. Then I will talk about what the function is of affect, and at the end I will speak about how affect relates to other types of consciousness. So we start with the functionalist problem of consciousness, and this relates to the famous David Chalmers, who was the person who first articulated the hard problem of consciousness, which has become literally the Holy Grail in neuroscience today. So let me begin, before I explain the functionalist problem, let me begin by putting the hard problem itself on the screen. This is Chalmers' paper, the one in which he articulated it, and he says the following. It's undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience, but the question of how it is that these systems are subjects of experience is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience, the quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea? How can we explain why there is something it's like to entertain a mental image or experience an emotion? It's widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of how and why it so arises. I've put in bold the bit about something it's like, because this is this phrase is used a lot by philosophers these days. It speaks to the phenomenal field, the qualitative, experiential being there of consciousness. So there we have our problem. It's David Chalmers was not the first person to draw attention to this problem. It's in fact been with us probably for as long as we've been thinking about our experience. And it's been a long-standing issue in philosophy. But the person that Chalmers builds on more directly than anyone else is Thomas Nagel, who wrote a famous paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And in that paper, philosophers, I know there are probably some philosophers here, I must be careful, but these are the sorts of things philosophers think about. And Thomas Nagel in that paper said, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it's like for the organism. And a little bit later in the same paper, he says, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue about how this could be done. So my aim in this presentation tonight is to give us a clue. Here's our question. I've put it in big, bold letters so that we're all very clear about what the question is that we're addressing, and you can see how I've distilled this from the quotations that I've just read to you. Why and how is there something it is like to be an organism? Something it's like for the organism. This is what Nagel and Chalmers are saying we have no good theory about. Now, here comes the problem of functionalism. I'm sorry, it's quite a long quote. This whole lecture is not going to be taken up with these sort of quotes. This is just to lay the groundwork. This is Chalmers speaking again in the same paper in which he articulated the hard problem in the first place. He says the easy problems, as opposed to the hard one, the easy problems of cognitive science are easy, precisely because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. To explain a cognitive function, we need only specify a mechanism that can perform the function. The methods of cognitive science are well suited for this sort of explanation, and so are well suited to the easy problems of consciousness. By contrast, the hard problem is hard precisely because it is not a problem about the performance of functions. The problem persists even when the performance of all the relevant functions is explained. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of functions. To see this, note that even when we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves the question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? So, I think we have a further, so there we have a further statement of, or a second version, or an additional version, rather, of the problem that we're trying to solve. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? Now, to elaborate a little bit on these foundational points, which are the issues I'm addressing in this lecture, I want to explain what he means when he says that specifying the function of a cognitive operation is an easy thing. We do this all the time, but this thing doesn't work when it comes to consciousness. He's saying that specifying the mechanism, the functional mechanism of how, say, visual processing or memory processing or whatever cognitive processing goes on, you can explain the whole thing, but it doesn't require there to be any phenomenal feel, any experience within that mechanism. It doesn't explain how the experience comes about in the mechanism and why it comes about. And there's an argument by another philosopher named Frank Jackson that's frequently cited in this respect, and I will now give you a sort of a condensed version of his argument. It's not the full version, it's not exactly the way he puts it, but I'm just trying to get the main point across. It's called the knowledge argument. And Jackson says, imagine a visual neuroscientist named Mary, who unfortunately is blind. She has learned everything that there is to know about vision, from the physics of how light waves act upon the photosensitive rods and cones in the retina, how the retinal cells fire in response to this impact of light, and how those nerve impulses are transmitted through the optic chiasm to the lateral geniculate body. We know all of this stuff, and how it goes from there via the optic radiation to the occipital cortex. And we know what happens in occipital cortex. We know a great deal about what happens in visual occipital cortex in particular. It's the most studied bit of cortex that there is. And so Mary knows all of this. Mary also knows about the further processing of this visual information. There are various processing streams, various specialized modules that process various aspects of vision. I won't go into the details, you get the idea. One day, Mary, the blind neuroscientist who knows absolutely everything that there is to know about the functional mechanism, the physiology and anatomy and physics, everything that there is to know about the functional mechanism of vision, one day, happily, the gift of sight is not returned to her, is given to her. And so for the first time in her life, she has visual experience. And Frank Jackson's argument is as follows. She will now learn something utterly new about vision that she never knew before. She will now learn what it is like to see, what the phenomenal feel of redness and blueness and all of this wonderful stuff that constitutes visual conscious experience. All of this she will learn only by having those experiences. There was nothing in the functional mechanistic account of vision that would have told her anything about what it is like to see. And so Jackson's argument upon which Chalmers is piggybacking, Jackson's argument is, therefore, our normal way of doing science in cognitive neuroscience doesn't account for the phenomenal field. It seems to somehow exist in some other realm. And also, very importantly, it seems to not do anything, because the whole mechanism, from beginning to end, doesn't need to include, as Mary's case shows, doesn't need to include anything about the conscious experiences. This relates to another philosophical argument, and I think this is probably the last bit of philosophy that I'll mention in my foundation statements. I think this goes back to Hume. It's called the inverted spectrum argument. And according to this argument, if you all see something called red and you call it red, you know what the quality of redness is like. I also see something called red and I call it red because I'm like you. But it may be that, in fact, if you could get inside of my conscious experience, you would see that what I'm calling red actually looks like blue. And according to the inverted spectrum argument, that would make not one jot of difference. I would be able to function perfectly well seeing blue and calling it red, which is the same quality, I mean the same word, but actually the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the quality of redness and blueness. These qualities make absolutely no difference to the causal nexus of the universe. Okay, so now you see what we are up against. This is the functionalist problem of consciousness. Now I'm going to tell you consciousness is not a cognitive function, and therefore it's exempted from this problem. Here is a paper, it's a review paper by John Kihlstrom, the title of which says it all. Perception without awareness of what is perceived, learning without awareness of what is learnt. One of the main discoveries of cognitive neuroscience over the last few decades, perhaps starting in the 80s, certainly by the 90s it had become the mainstream view, is that most cognition does not require consciousness. Most of our cognition goes on without consciousness. When I say most, I mean most. Most of our perception and our learning goes on without us being there. We have no awareness that it's going on, but my word, it's going on, big time, all the time. The other review paper, which is normally cited in this context, the context being that we've learned in cognitive neuroscience that cognition does not require consciousness, that perception happens perfectly well without consciousness, that learning happens perfectly well without consciousness, that executive control happens perfectly well without consciousness, language functioning happens perfectly well without consciousness, is this paper by Barge and Chartrand. Again, the title really says it, The Unbearable Automaticity of Being. They review the world literature in this paper and come to the conclusion, you know, Americans like to measure things, they come to the conclusion that 95% of your everyday goal-directed, purposive cognitive activity goes on outside of consciousness, 95%. So the point that I'm making is that functions like vision, the cognitive functions like vision, like the topic that Mary was an expert in, perhaps it's not so surprising that we can explain how they work without reference to consciousness, because they can work without consciousness. Vision does not require consciousness. Learning does not require, no cognition requires consciousness. To give you, and I'm only going to give you, in everything I'm going to say in this brief lecture, I'm only going to give you snippets, illustrative snippets of the evidence. I can't obviously possibly comprehensively review all the evidence for the things I'm saying to you in this kind of didactic, dogmatic fashion. But one example to illustrate what I'm saying to you is the fact that you can, with a tachistoscope, which is an apparatus that flashes information, visual information to you so quickly that you are not aware that you've experienced anything, that you're not aware that anything has happened at all, let alone something visual, let alone what the content of that visual information is. It's demonstrable, it has been demonstrated repeatedly with this paradigm, that you can flash words associated with faces that the person doesn't know that they've seen and doesn't know that they've read. And in this way, you can bias the attitude of people toward those faces. So you show 5 randomly allocated faces in group 1, and with the first face it says murderer, second face it says rapist, third face it says Zuma or something like that. Then the other faces, they say good Samaritan, a loving parent or whatever. And then and all of this happens subliminally, all of this happens outside of consciousness. Then after that, you're shown the faces supraliminally, consciously, and you're asked which of these faces, which of these people do you like and which of them do you not like, and it goes exactly as those names, those adjectives suggest. You like these ones and you don't like those ones, and when asked why, you confabulate reasons, or you just say, I don't know, just a gut feeling. It's just a sort of intuition. So you don't know why you've made those choices, but we know why you've made those choices. It's because you've seen visually recognized faces, learnt those faces, words, read them with comprehension, associated them through memory processing with those faces, and this has influenced your behavior. That's the extent to which cognition is possible without consciousness. And the cognition I'm referring to, I need to emphasize, is cortical. It's not just any old information processing. It's specifically human cortical processing. It's the highest, best kind of cognition that we're so proud of. Only us humans can read. Only cortex can read. Only neocortex can read. So even the most recent, evolutionarily recent form of cortex and of visual information processing at the highest level, face recognition and word recognition, all of that doesn't need consciousness. In fact, the point has been so powerfully demonstrated in cognitive neuroscience that by the 1990s, the question was seriously being asked, what's consciousness for? It doesn't do anything. It's not necessary. It doesn't add anything. We can do stuff of the kind that I've just been talking to you about without it. It's such a troublesome thing. Why bother to have it at all? You'll be happy to know I'm going to address that point as we go along. So I'm saying consciousness is not a cognitive function. Cognition goes on without consciousness. That's one of my main points. I hope I've made it clearly. I'm now going to say that consciousness is in fact an affective function. The rediscovery of the ubiquity of the unconscious in cognition by cognitive neuroscientists in the late 20th century was just that, a rediscovery of something that Sigmund Freud discovered 100 years earlier. Sigmund Freud, when he first said that most cognitive processing goes on unconsciously, was thought to be crazy. How can you say mental functions operate unconsciously, because mental means conscious? And so Freud had a big battle 100 years before the cognitive scientists to make exactly the same point that they make today. But please note this point, that the discoverer of the unconscious and the ubiquity of unconsciousness in cognition, he said that there's one mental function to which this discovery does not apply, and that is feelings. So even the discoverer of the unconscious said that feelings can't be unconscious. Please note he's using various words here, my pointer, emotions, feelings, and affects. Different people mean different things by these words, even within my field. It's very hard to get anyone to agree what exactly an emotion is and what exactly an affect is. So I've italicized this word feelings because I think it's the clearest one. And I want to define it for you. I want to define it. I want to tell you what I mean by feelings. I mean feelings, that you feel. Who ever heard of a feeling that you don't feel? It's by definition felt and therefore conscious. So leave aside all of Freud's arguments and just because you don't need to know them. I'm just saying, even Freud said that feelings have to be conscious because otherwise you can't feel them. Who ever heard of a pleasure? What's the point of a pleasure that you don't feel? Or an unpleasant feeling that you don't feel? It won't be unpleasant because you won't feel it. But It's not a linguistic point that I'm making when I say that feelings have to be felt. I'm going to show you in the next few slides that actually consciousness is feeling, that the elemental form of consciousness, the very foundation of consciousness, the bedrock of consciousness is feeling. So I'm making 2 points. The first is a linguistic point. I'm saying feelings surely have to be felt. Surely this is the mental function we should be looking at if we want to understand consciousness, unlike these cognitive functions which don't have to be felt. They happen easily without consciousness, so it's no surprise we can have functionalist accounts of them that don't require any sentient being there. But you can't have an account of feeling that doesn't explain the feeling, because the feeling is the heart of the matter of what feeling is about. This, I think, is where we should look for an explanation of consciousness. And then I'm making the second point, which is that this is not an arbitrary or clever little piece of sort of trick, because it turns out that feeling is the elemental form of consciousness, and that's what I'm going to now argue. This is an MRI scan of a 3-year-old girl's brain, except there's a big problem, which is that her cortex is missing. This is the brainstem down here, and this is where the cortex should be, and in her case, there's no cortex. This condition is called hydranencephaly, not to be confused with hydrocephaly. Hydranencephaly means where the encephalon where the cortex should be, there is water. In other words, cerebrospinal fluid. Before I say more about this girl and about this condition, I want to say something about the brainstem, which, as I said, is intact in her case. We always thought that consciousness flows in from the outside. It flows in with sensory processing. And hence our consciousness consists in visual experiences, auditory experiences, somatosensory experiences, gustatory experiences, and olfactory ones. That's what the ingredients of consciousness are. It therefore came as an enormous surprise in 1949, mark you, a long, long time ago, when 2 physiologists, Magoon and Maruzzi, discovered that this part of the brain, the brain stem, in fact, is where all the lights are switched on. That if you have damage to the core of that very ancient structure, which we share with all vertebrates, if you have damage to the core of that, which from the moment they discovered it became known as the reticular activating system, then all consciousness is obliterated. If you damage the visual cortex, which should be there, you lose visual consciousness. Somatosensory consciousness is lost with there, auditory consciousness lost if there's cortical lesions there, but all consciousness is lost if you damage the reticular activating system. This was such a surprise that the way that Magoon and Maruzzi dealt with it was in the age-old scientific tradition of fudging it. They thought, well, we have to somehow explain this away and keep our old theory intact. And so they introduced a division between what they called the level of consciousness and the contents of consciousness. They said cortex provides the contents and the brain stem provides the level. In other words, the volume control, the switching on of the lights that we lost over there. It's nothing more than a power switch. It's like you take a television set and you plug it into the wall and you watch the telly. If you unplug it, or if you cut the cord, then everything switches off. But it would be absurd to say that therefore televisual stuff comes from the power cable. That's a very apt analogy for how Magoon and Maruzzi understood what the reticular activating system does. It provides the power. They said it's a necessary precondition for consciousness, but just as the television set itself actually does the televisual stuff, likewise the cortex is actually processing the contents. And once you switch the power on, then you have contents of consciousness. Please note, because it's absolutely crucial to what I'm saying, and it's not me who's saying this, this is the standard view, it's absolutely crucial to the standard view that the level of consciousness is a quantitative dimension. It doesn't have quality. The qualities come with the contents of consciousness, and as I say, they're tied to our various sensory modalities. So that's the standard view. Since 1949, this is what has changed, or is changing, and this is what I'm so excited about. So now we go back to this unfortunate girl, 3 years old, born with absolutely no cortex, and I'm now going to show you a picture of her. There she is. She's the big one. Please note she's awake. But that's no surprise, because that's what Magoon and Maruzzi and all of us ever since 1949 have said, that the brain stem provides this arousal, this wakefulness, this level of consciousness, this thing that we measure quantitatively on the Glasgow coma scale. By the way, this girl also has absence seizures. In other words, she loses consciousness and regains it. Even her parents can see when she's gone and when she's back again. So in this global sense, she has consciousness. But there's something else interesting about this picture, and that is that when her little brother, her baby brother, is placed on her lap, she goes, ah, and she likes it. Okay, now you might ask, how on earth can that happen? How does she even know her baby brother's been placed on her lap? So let me go back to this image and the brain stem and tell you that at the back of the brain stem, you can just see it there. I'm going to try and not shake, just there. I did shake. Just there. That's called the tectum. In us, we call it the superior colliculi, where visual information comes from the eyes. It doesn't only from the retina go to the visual cortex, where you get conscious vision. It also goes from the retina, from the optic nerves. The information is sent to the superior colliculi. And there the information is processed unconsciously. Cortex is required for conscious vision, but all you need is superior colliculi for unconscious vision. This is where the famous blind sight comes from, those of you who've heard of blind sight. Patients who have damage only to the visual cortex, the rest of the cortex is intact, they lose visual cortex, they go blind. And you then say to them, to the cortically blind patient, you say, where am I pointing my pointer on the screen? They say, Mark, I'm blind. And I say, yeah, but just guess. Where do you think, what does your gut feel tell you? And they say, well, okay, I'll guess, top right. I say, thanks. Now? They say, bottom right. I say, now? They say, center. I say, now? They say, top left. I say, how do you know that? You're blind. They say, I don't know, I'm just guessing. I'm just going with my gut feel. So how they can do that is because they're receiving the visual information unconsciously. They just don't know it consciously. So this is how, in regard to all of her sensory modalities, this little girl receives information about the outside world. She just doesn't know that she's receiving the information. But please note, she reacts to it emotionally. She is happy. And when you take her little brother away, she goes, ah, and she arches her back. She wants him back again. And this applies to all of the basic emotions. And it doesn't only apply to this girl. It applies to all such children. Here's another such child. They are emotional beings. They display all of the basic emotions like separation distress, like nurture and care, like fear, like rage, and so on. And they display it in a situationally appropriate fashion. So I hope you get the point. The point is that the brain stem, which is all that this girl or these girls have, these children have, is not just a power switch. It does have a qualitative feel of it. It turns out it feels like something to be awake. And that consciousness does not consist only in these external sensory qualities, but also in this endogenous, this quality which is not about the outside world, it's not about objects, it's about the subject of the mind. And this qualitative dimension we call affect, or feeling. So it's not true that it's just a level. There is a qualitative feel to this basic form of consciousness which switches on the lights. I need you to please also pay careful attention to that. This is not just a sixth sense, as it were, one coming from the inside. It is the foundational sense, because if you switch that one off, all the lights go out. You can lose any one of the other ones, and indeed, as I'm showing you with these kids, you can lose all of the other ones. But the feeling still remains. Feeling is therefore the power source. It is the necessary precondition for all other forms of consciousness. Cortex is not intrinsically conscious. Cortex is rendered conscious from below by the upper brainstem. And the surprise is it is rendered conscious by feeling. You feel your way into your external perceptions, and then you become conscious of them. Now, I know this is a very big claim, and I've already told you I can't go through all the evidence in a lecture like this, but I think this claim is so big, I better just give you a little bit more of the evidence than just these two girls. Here is, so what I've just shown you is the lesion method, okay, damaging the structures in question. And I've showed you two things about the structures in question in regard to the lesion method. I've said if you damage cortex, you lose one or another one of your cognitive, extraceptive, perceptual functions, which, as it happens, also function perfectly well without being conscious. And I've said you can lose all of them and you're still conscious. Then I've shown that if you lesion the brainstem, well, I haven't shown it, I've just told you. In fact, let me tell you more specifically. If you damage just 2 cubic millimeters of a part of the reticular activating system known as the parabrachial complex, 2 cubic millimeters, I mean, that's this much tissue, all the lights go out. So this is the foundational form of consciousness, big time. This is the most concentrated consciousness-producing tissue that is known to us. And I've said about this lesion method, I've said, please note, you can remove cortex, affect is still there, feeling is still there. That's what I've showed you so far. Now, here's another method, which is called deep brain stimulation. If you take an electrode and you put it into the reticular activating system, in this case into a nucleus called the substantia nigra, which is another part of this core brainstem arousal region, this is what happens. I'm describing here, well, not me, somebody named Blomstedt is describing one of many, many cases where you put an electrode into these structures, you get intense emotional reactions. This is a 65-year-old woman. She has no psychiatric history, no psychiatric illness in her life until this moment, when the electrode is put into her substantia nigra, switched on, and this happens. The patient's face expressed profound sadness within 5 seconds. Although still alert, the patient leaned to the right, started to cry, and verbally communicated feelings of sadness, guilt, uselessness, and hopelessness, such as, I'm falling down in my head. I no longer wish to live, to see anything, hear anything, feel anything. When asked why she was crying, and if she felt pain, she responded, no, I'm fed up with life. I've had enough. I don't want to live anymore. I'm disgusted with life. Everything's useless, always feeling worthless. I'm scared in this world. When asked why she was sad, she replied, I'm tired. I want to hide in a corner. I'm crying over myself. Of course, I'm hopeless. Why am I bothering you? The depression disappeared less than 90 seconds after stimulation was stopped. For the next 5 minutes, the patient was in a slightly hypomanic state, that means a little overhappy, and she laughed and joked with the examiner, playfully pulling his tie. She recalled the entire episode. Stimulation at other sites, this is not in the reticular activating system, did not elicit this psychiatric response. She, this woman, amazingly, was willing to let them do it a few more times. And she was blind, I don't mean physically, I don't mean in the literal sense, she was unaware as to when they were stimulating in the substantia nigra, in the reticular activating system, and when they were stimulating out. And every time they stimulated in the substantia nigra, she fell into a suicidal depression. Okay, so this is the second bit of evidence, in addition to the lesion evidence, that this part of the brain is far from just being a power supply. It is an intense feeling-generating part of the brain. Here's a third method. This is a method called positron emission tomography, where you can image which parts of the brain, by looking at where the highest metabolic rate is, where the highest cellular activity is, you can see which part of the brain is generating a particular function. The functions that we're looking at here are affective, emotional functions. This patient is sad. Please note the activation is in the brain stem, not in the cortex. This patient is angry. So when I say patient, these are normal research subjects. The activation is in the brain stem, not in the cortex. This one is happy. The activation is mainly, well, it's subcortical. This one's got a little bit of cortex, but please note here, brain stem again. This one is in state of fear. again, the activation is in the brainstem, not in the cortex. If you look at these overall, what you see is the cortex is blue. Blue means less activated. Red means highly activated. I mean, blue actually means that the activation has gone down. So that's a third method showing that the feelings come from the brainstem. Here is an intense feeling that I hope most of you are familiar with. It's called an orgasm. This is a man having an orgasm. And please note where the activation is. The activation is in the brainstem. In fact, it's in the transitional zone between the midbrain and the diencephalon in the reticular activating system. And on another image I could show you, cortex is shut down big time during an orgasm. Perhaps this is a good moment for me to remind you of my initial point about feelings. You have to feel them. Who ever heard of an unconscious orgasm? You know, it wouldn't be one if you didn't feel it. Okay, that's the whole point. That there are things in nature called feelings, and they're conscious things. And I'm showing you that these conscious things are generated in the brainstem, in the very part of the brain where the power supply, the very source of consciousness, is the source of feeling. They are one and the same thing. So I said to you earlier that the question was asked in the 1990s, why do we have consciousness at all? It seems, as I said, unnecessary to cognitive processing. Even very elaborate cognitive processing like face recognition and reading with comprehension doesn't require consciousness. So what is the consciousness for? And the view began to take hold in the late 1990s and early 2000s by these two colleagues of mine. They led the way, Jaak Panksepp and Antonio Damasio. They started to say, well, consciousness is feeling, that this is what consciousness is for. It's so that we can feel our cognitions. And I'm now going to elaborate on that as I move forwards. I'm going to say that affect is a homeostatic function. Remember where we started from. We started from the view that you can give a functional account of cognition, it won't explain how and why we feel like something, how and why there is a qualitative, experiential, what it is likeness that you can account for the whole mechanism without having to make any reference to or even have any experience of conscious qualitative fields. And the view therefore was that they seem to not be necessary, they seem to not be doing anything, and they seem to require some other different kind of explanation than the one we normally use in cognitive neuroscience. And I've said to you, this is not true of feelings, that they can't operate unconsciously. You can't have an account of feeling, a functional account of feeling that doesn't tell you how and why it feels like something, because that's the whole point of feelings. It's to feel them. So now I'm going to say what that functional account is. This is probably the most important slide I'm going to show you this evening. Remember, I started late, eh? This is about, I want to tell you about one of the most basic, fundamental, rudimentary biological functions that there is. It's called homeostasis. Even single cells have homeostatic functions. Homeostasis operates in all living things, actually even in plants. Homeostasis is at the very heart of what distinguishes living from non-living matter. Non-living matter is subject to, those of you who are physicists in the room, I don't remember where you are, will know about entropy. Entropy, everything goes to shit. Okay? Everything dissipates. Every difference is, think of, a good way of thinking about it is, take hot water, take a battery, and put it on the table, and come back a few months later, the energy will have run down. This is an absolutely 1000% predictable thing. It's going to happen. This is what always happens. Take hot water and take a cold bathtub and add hot water. The hot water under the hot tap doesn't stay there in a large globule. It evens out and disperses its hotness, equalizes with the coldness of the other bath other bath water, this is what happens. Things dissipate, entropy is an absolutely relentless, irreversible, necessary accompaniment of every natural process. Living things resist entropy. We don't just dissipate. We behave like that globule under the bathtub that decides, I'm not going to dissipate, I'm staying here, thanks. I'm not going to just spread out and equalize with my ambient environment. A good example, therefore, of homeostasis, of the thing I'm talking about, of this anti-entropic tendency, is temperature. The core body temperature of a human being has to remain within an extremely narrow range. It has to remain between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. This room, I would guess, is 18 degrees Celsius. If I was to do what the bath water does and even myself out with this room temperature, I'd be dead. Okay, a human being cannot live at 18 degrees. So we have to work to remain within that homeostatic, that viable range. I'm calling it nirvana here for funny reasons of my own. But this is a homeostatic settling point, and we have to remain there. And so this is what I mean by anti-entropic tendency of living things. Living things oppose entropy, and they do it via this mechanism called homeostasis. They have viable, preferred, expected states that they have to remain in, and each phenotype has its own viable states. So this I've illustrated with reference to core body temperature, but it applies to many, many other things. It applies to blood-gas balance, it applies to energy balance, fluid balance. I'm talking about things like, if there's too much water in your body, you'll die. If there's too little water in your body, you'll die. If there's too much salt in your body, you'll die. If there's too little salt in your body, you'll die. Too much oxygen in your body, you'll die. Too little oxygen, you'll die. Too much carbon dioxide, you'll die. Too little carbon dioxide, you die. Too much sugar, you die. Too little sugar, you die, etc. Okay? You have to remain within these very limited ranges. You can't just let entropy allow you to dissipate and disappear into oblivion. This is what life is all about. Now, feeling homeostasis is an extension of this mechanism. Before I talk about feelings, let me just explain that when you deviate away from your homeostatic settling point, this is a crisis. It is a life-threatening situation. You've got to get back. And so we have reflexes which send us back. Okay, all your autonomic reflexes, the things that keep your heart beating and your blood vessels dilating and your darums peristalsing and your alveoli and your lungs sucking in that oxygen and etc., and the heart pumping that oxygen about in the blood, etc., etc. All of that's done by reflexes. Those reflexes are reflex back, bad, reflex back. Okay, that's how they work, to keep you within your viable range. Now, that works fantastically for very limited organisms and very limited parts of our own organism, the part known as the vegetative nervous system, for a good reason, because it functions like a vegetable. It's completely predictable. Nothing ever happens to vegetables. Plants, they're stuck in one place. Yeah, and the sun rises in the morning and the sun sets at night, and it rises there and it sets there, and summer, and then what's that next thing? Autumn, and then winter, and then spring. It's always the same. So they got reflexes that just do this stuff, automatically, vegetatively, and there are parts of our bodies that function like that too. The clinically notorious example is blood pressure. You have no knowledge about how your blood pressure is doing until it's too late. But there's something enormously valuable added if you are aware of how you're doing in relation to these these absolutely crucial bodily functions. And I will explain that with reference to what we call respiratory, it's called suffocation alarm. Respiratory regulation happens automatically. You weren't, until I'm now mentioning it to you, you weren't aware that you need to breathe, If you hold your breath, you become aware, shit, I need to breathe, and then you breathe. But normally it happens by an autonomic reflex. But when there's a crisis, like something blocks your throat, or you're in a carbon dioxide-filled room, you very quickly become conscious of the need to breathe. This is called suffocation alarm, air hunger. And what happens? It suddenly comes to consciousness. And what do you feel? You feel something unpleasant called suffocation alarm. And you need to breathe. What does this add? It makes the organism aware, I'm in a bad state. But why doesn't this apply to all the other autonomic ones? It doesn't apply to all those vegetative ones because they're automatic. They always do the same thing. What being aware of your state does is it can guide your behavior so that as you move, say, for example, I don't know, now this room's full of carbon dioxide. What do I do? Shall I go there or shall I go there? I'll tell you what happens. If you go there, it gets worse. Okay? And you start to feel it. How? Because you feel worse. And so you come down again. That's better. Do I go out that door or do I go out that door? I don't know. You've got to suck it and see, okay, as it were. And so you open that door, it's worse. You open that door, thank God, oxygen, okay? And please note, I'm dramatizing this not because I'm a drama queen. I'm dramatizing it because I'm trying to show you it's about feeling. Okay, this is what feeling is for. It's about existential crises. Life and death matters, and it guides what you do in unpredictable situations. This is an enormous adaptive advantage. It means that you don't have to rely only on absolutely preordained reflexes. You're able to, in regard to these vital bodily functions, you're able to do things on the trot, here and now, make decisions, make choices. And this enables you to survive in unpredicted, novel environments, and that's what we do. Not only us humans, I want to tell you, but all of us conscious creatures, all of us who've got this wonderful thing called feeling homeostasis. So feeling is an extension of homeostasis. It enables us to extend homeostatic mechanisms into voluntary action, into the making of choices. Now, I want you to pay attention carefully to this bit. Choice would not be possible without a value system. There has to be something that's good and something that's bad, something that's better to do and something that's worse to do. Otherwise, how can you make a choice? So choices are always embedded within a value system of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. In biology, we have a fundamental value system, which is to stay alive is good, to expire is bad. Okay? It's not me who's saying this. This is what God said, or Darwin said. Okay? Confirmation. Okay? We have a value system in biology, whether you like it or not, which says that survival is good and not survival is bad. The whole of evolution is driven by that. I won't go into the details because it's so obviously true. Now, the view that I'm putting to you here, and this is not my own view, this is Damasio's view, and before him, Panksepp's view, is that this is what feeling is for. This is what consciousness in its most rudimentary form is for. It's so that you can feel how you're doing in a value system, whether things are going better or worse for you. Unpleasant feelings, in red here, unpleasure, means things are going worse for you. In terms of the value systems of biology, pleasure means things are going better for you. So when things are going worse, they feel worse, and you avoid them. You retreat from those things. When things feel better, that means this is better for your biological chances of surviving, and so you approach them, and I've used the example, as I just did, of air hunger. But this applies to all feelings. Before I speak about other feelings, well, actually, I don't know which way to do this. Let me do it this way. That we call drive. It's a demand for work. In this case, a demand upon the mind for work. Okay, we call it a drive. And then this is the result of the work. The work is required to get you back there. This can, as I said, happen reflexively, but when it comes to voluntary action, that's the work. And so you have to make a choice based on feeling. Shall I do this or shall I do this? Which is the right thing to do? That's what I've already said to you. What I now want to say to you is the difference between this and a reflex also is you can learn from experience. It is the absolute basic, it's called the law of effect, except the behaviorists who discovered the law of effect, which is basically that things that they call them that are rewarding. They didn't like to use feelings, but I don't know what a reward is if it's not a thing that feels nice. Things that are rewarding, we do them more. We learn and do those things more. Things that are punishing, I don't know what a punishment is if it doesn't feel bad, but things that are punishing, we stop doing them. That's what the law of effect says. It's an absolute foundation of all learning. So this is also, not only can we survive in novel environments, we can learn in unpredicted environments to better predict what to do in future. We learn from experience. And the word here is experience in the sense of phenomenal feeling experience. That's what feeling is for. That's what experience is for. It gives you qualitative feeling of goodness and badness in relation to what you're doing in the outside world, and you learn from that. So what I'm saying is that this reflex that now gets supplemented by learned behaviors, and this, again, is just such a whopping great adaptive advantage that it hardly needs me to argue it. Now I said I didn't know what to do first. I did that first, and I'll do this second. This applies to all feelings. It doesn't apply only to being too hot or to being in a state of respiratory distress. It applies to all feelings. This simple model applies to all feelings. First of all feelings have this thing, a badness and a goodness. We call it valence. Valence is about value, okay? This is unlike external perception. External perceptions do not have intrinsic value. We bestow value upon external things, but dint of how they make us feel. They become rewarding or punishing. And this is how the world, why the world has any qualities at all. We feel our way into the world and we bestow feeling onto, but the percepts themselves, redness and blueness, don't have an intrinsic qualitative valence, a goodness or a badness, which is why you can just swap them around, it makes no difference. But the feelings, this is what distinguishes feelings from cognitions. Feelings have an intrinsic valence, every single one of them works like that. Now they have one other thing, which is that they have a categorical quality. Each feeling feels qualitatively different from every other one because you need to know which thing is going badly. Okay, so suffocation alarm feels different from being too hot. And this applies to all affects. Needing to pee feels different from needing to breathe. Please note, I'm talking about very basic bodily functions. You don't think about it like this normally, but these things have affect attached to them. Okay, it feels bad to have a full bum, you know, and it feels good to get rid of it. Very basic things. Feels good to breathe when you need oxygen and so on. But it doesn't only apply to, the point I'm making is that it feels different, okay? So hunger feels different from thirst, feels different from suffocation alarm, feels different from whatever else you want. That's what I mean by a categorical quality. So each one of them has valence and a categorical, not a quantitative difference, a categorical difference, because you have to know which thing is going well and or badly, which thing demands voluntary action. This is what feeling is for. So those are the basic rules about how feeling works. And now I want you to remember, I think, let's hope the next slide is the one that I thought it was going to be. Yes. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all of this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? Duh. Okay, how can feeling go on without any feel? And why don't these functions go on without experience? I hope you can see the functions I've just described to you, which are really important biological functions. They require experience. They require feel. They require this valence and this categorical qualitative difference that I've spoken to you about. I need to add, in fact, I meant to add that earlier, when I said different feelings. Those are basic bodily feelings. The same applies to emotional feelings. Like, for example, there's a thing here, let's say fear. Fear predicts the predicted state, the expected state, the viable state is, I shall not be under attack from a predator. If I'm not under attack from a predator, I don't feel fear. But when one starts coming for me, it's like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. Okay? Fear. That's an emotion. And you have a reflex. In fact, we call it an instinct because it's a little bit more complex than a reflex, which says freeze or flee. Okay, that you don't need to learn. But I hope that you all know a little bit more about what to do when you're scared other than just freeze or flee. In fact, if you did only that, you would have an anxiety disorder. You know, whenever you're scared, you freeze or you run away. Okay, we're very grateful to have reflexes and instincts, but they're not enough. Okay, the world is much more complicated and unpredictable than your reflexes and instincts can deal with. That's why we have voluntary action and learning from experience. You learn what else to do, and you have to learn what else to fear other than the innate triggers that are built into these reflexive instinctual systems. So fear is an example. I've told you two things here. The one is